This is a real brief opening, just to put everybody on the same page. The question is, where does oil and gas waste come from? And you see that shooting up oil in the air. That's not all oil. That's a lot of stuff. It comes out of the ground with the oil and gas. The formational water that comes out of the oil and gas formations, what you're seeing there is 7 to 10 barrels of brine for every barrel of crude oil that's coming out of that plume, and or 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. So when we think about oil and gas production, we think about that as the main issue, but it really isn't. The oil and gas is really a byproduct, and the brine or the formational water is the major product. And so we have more stuff to get rid of than we're trying to get. Next slide. So why should we be worried about all that brine that we're spreading on the roads? Well, it has radioactive materials in it. It has heavy metals in it. Obviously, it has lots of salts in it. It has BTEX, which is benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, cancer-causing. And it has PFAS and PFOAs, our forever chemicals that we are told are going to last us forever and will probably give us cancer as well. Okay, next. So once we're spreading this innocuous salt water on the roads, which isn't very innocuous, what happens to it? Well, it comes out as a liquid slurry. And if it moves into the water, it moves into either the surface water or it will move into the groundwater, depending upon what it lands on. If it lands on the side of the road into the soils, again, you can leach into the water, both surface water and groundwater, or it can stay attached to those soils. And when it stays attached to those soils, it becomes dust. And when the dust blows, especially in the summertime, everything it touches has all of those elements that we were concerned about. All right, I think that should give us a heads up of what is in brine and why we're concerned about it. And I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Julie. So yeah, now I'm going to give a little overview of some of the health effects of exposure to some components of brine. So she mentioned that it contains a lot of toxic chemicals, and two major components that can cause health problems that I'm going to talk about today are heavy metals, which include things like lead, zinc, manganese, and barium, and radioactive materials, which include things like uranium, radium, radon, and thorium. And so for each individual chemical that's either a heavy metal or a radioactive material in brine, I'll give an overview of the organs it targets, how it impacts your health, and what we know about its ability to cause cancer. So we'll start off with a few heavy metals. Great. The first one we'll talk about is lead, which people have probably heard about as a dangerous chemical in other contexts. One of the reasons lead is really dangerous is because it can affect almost every organ in the body, but the one that it has the most serious and devastating impacts on is the brain. Next slide. Okay, so how can lead affect your health? Again, because it has the big impacts on the brain. Some of the kind of more famous effects that it can have is problems with learning, memory, and attention. And children are a lot more vulnerable to the health effects of lead because their brains are still growing. So the effects on learning and memory and attention that happen in children can then become lifelong learning disabilities or brain damage. It can also cause weakness or numbness in the hands and feet, high blood pressure, anemia, which is a term for when your blood cells can't transport as much oxygen to the rest of your body, which can lead to like dizziness and tiredness and fatigue. It can also cause kidney failure, miscarriage or premature birth if people who are pregnant are exposed, and it can even cause death. Okay, when it comes specifically to cancer, the US Department of Health and Human Services says that lead is likely to cause cancer. The EPA says it probably causes cancer. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer says that they can't definitively make a determination. So these are all reputable science-based organizations that have different methodologies and standards for how they determine and classify things as causing cancer. Lead is certainly dangerous. Maybe not all of them are as certain as others about its ability to cause cancer, but it does certainly seem like there is quite a bit of evidence that it can. Okay, and the next chemical in brine that I'll talk about is zinc. So zinc is known to affect the stomach and blood. In laboratory studies in animals, exposure can also severely affect reproductive organs, but it's not quite clear if that's true in people as well. Okay, so how can zinc impact your health? Next slide. So you may be familiar with zinc as a metal that's required in small doses to maintain our health. But when we get exposed in really large doses, like you can if you're exposed to brine, it can cause nausea and vomiting. It can cause anemia. It can lower levels of good cholesterol. And one of the things that's kind of scary about zinc is that you don't have to be exposed to it for a long period of time to see any of these health effects. It's not like you need to be exposed to high levels of zinc for your whole life in order to be affected. Just a brief window of exposure can cause these adverse health impacts. Next slide. And when it comes to cancer, again, it's unknown if zinc can cause cancer. It doesn't mean that it definitely can't, but these organizations say that they don't definitively have enough information to make a determination one way or another. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a few specific chemicals that are radioactive materials that are found in brine. Next slide. Just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, first I'll give a brief overview of what radioactivity is. The symbol on the right you might be familiar with. It's a symbol to indicate that a substance or maybe an area that contains a substance is radioactive. So you kind of should be aware and alert. Okay, so the world is made up of chemical elements, and some of them are naturally unstable, or what we call radioactive. And these radioactive elements will then spontaneously convert into a different chemical element. And when they do that, they release energy, or what we call radiation. And being exposed to this radiation can harm our health because it can cause our cells to either die or to start functioning abnormally. And that can lead to organ failure, and it can also lead to cancer. Next slide. Okay, so uranium is a radioactive element that can be found in brine. It can affect a lot of different organs, including bones, liver, kidneys, and the brain. Next slide. The impact it can have on your health. It can cause a lot of your bones to be really brittle, so it can increase the chances or the number of broken bones that you get. It can cause kidney damage. In laboratory studies of animals, it has caused birth defects, but again, it's not quite certain that this is true in humans. And the effects on children might be more severe than the effects on adults because their organs are still growing. And when it comes to cancer, again, there's not necessarily a very clear consensus, but there is certainly quite a bit of evidence that suggests that uranium exposure can cause cancer. Next slide. But the real reason uranium is so dangerous is that it converts into other radioactive chemicals. So when uranium gives off radiation and converts into a different chemical, that chemical is radium. And radium itself is also radioactive. So if you can advance one. So radium will spontaneously convert into a chemical called radon. And in that process, radium will emit radiation that is known to cause bone, liver, blood, and breast cancer. And then radon itself is also radioactive. So it will spontaneously convert into an element called polonium. And the radiation it gives off while doing this is known to cause lung cancer. So this means that if there's uranium around, in brine, there's not just uranium. There's uranium and radium and radon. So you're not just exposed to the cancer-causing effects of uranium, you're also going to be exposed to the cancer-causing effects of radium and radon. Next. Okay, so I went through briefly a couple of individual chemicals that are components of brine and like the health effects that we know can occur if you get exposed to them. But an added wrinkle to all this is that these health effects I described are what scientists know happens if you're exposed to just that one chemical. But we know that when you're exposed to brine, you're going to be exposed to multiple chemicals simultaneously. So what happens when you're exposed to a mixture of chemicals? Unfortunately, the EPA doesn't have guidance on how to evaluate the effects of exposure to multiple chemicals at once. The scientific studies they look at and use to make their risk estimates only consider exposure to a single chemical on its own. But we know that if different chemicals target similar organs or biological pathways, then simultaneous exposure to them could make the health effects worse. And that this can cause health problems even if the amounts of those individual chemicals are within ranges that are deemed safe. And one recent study actually found that exposure to multiple chemicals that on their own don't cause cancer can lead to biological changes that ultimately do cause cancer. So it is really important to be thinking about the health effects of exposure to multiple chemicals at once. And so this is a major limitation of the guidance put forth by EPA and other agencies that determine risk estimates and kind of safe levels of chemicals, because as we know, people are never exposed to just one chemical. And so that means that these risk estimates reported by organizations like the EPA are, if anything, underestimates of the risks posed to human health. And so EPA and other agencies really should be taking a much stronger approach in their analysis and their guidelines to really more proactively protect people's health, because we know we're being put in danger.
All right, our next speaker is going to be Chief Silverio Caggiano, former Battalion Fire Chief of Youngstown. Chief, you're on mute.
What we're going to discuss here now is how this stuff gets up out of the environment and onto the roads aside from spreading, and what it does with people in the environment. Accidents occur. As you can see, there's a tanker here that is a brine hauling tanker. If it is full of the brine from the conventional wells, it's going to be dumping its product onto the road. The product will have the radium. It will have all the elements that we had mentioned previous, and it'll be being dumped all over the road. And of course, when accidents happen, they call the fire department, and we respond. And naturally, because this is a product that's coming from the oil and gas industry, it is exempt from any safety data sheet reporting. It is exempt from any, Clean Water Act. It's exempt from all of that. So when the fire department rolls up on this accident and they want to know what's in the tanker, they're just going to get brine. And no one is going to really know if they're not familiar with this incident. No one's really going to know what they're wading through or mucking through to maybe extricate the driver out of his cab. No one is really familiar with that. And neither are the people who put this stuff on the roads. One of the biggest hazards that they have putting this stuff on the road, from a test that Dr. Stoltz performed down at Duquesne University, you can see on the lower right-hand corner that truck has headspace to it. And into that headspace, when you have the radium-226 and 228 into the brine water, into that headspace will be radon. So when the truck driver goes and opens that up to vent it or to look inside, he's going to get a pretty good dose of radon and all the other products that go along with it. So as you can see, the environment for danger is there. It's there to the first responders, the police officers responding to the tractor trailer incident, the first responders putting the guy in. I mean, nobody knows what he's got. No one's for sure knows what he has in there. So you throw him in the back of the ambulance and you bring him to a hospital. So what are we doing there? We're spreading the contamination over and beyond. We're contaminating an ambulance. Firefighters taking the vehicle apart, they're getting exposed to it. Everybody that comes in contact with this is somehow getting exposed to this, and they're going to end up either bringing it home, or they're going to be tracking into the fire station, or they're going to be tracking it into the police station, or they're going to be bringing it with a contaminated patient into the hospital. Next slide. And the biggest problem you have with safety data sheets, even if you get a hold of them from these companies, is they are smoke and mirrors. Halliburton uses a product called Gasperm, and I'm using this as a good bad example. According to this, it gives you all kind of safety data sheet information, except when you look at substance CAS numbers. And the first one on the second page, it's listed as proprietary. He's not giving me a CAS number. And for us first responders, the CAS number is kind of like my way of verifying what you're telling me. If you hand me all this information here on these two sheets, and you're telling me that this is what it's going to do, what its physical properties are, how it's going to be handled on respiratory, this, that, and the other. In the fire service, and especially in HAZMAT, we verify by three sources. There's no way I can check this information to verify that what they're telling me is exactly what we're getting into. So even when they give you SDS information, a lot of times it is lacking a lot of information necessary to verify this information. As far as I know, they could have made this up just to trick us. So that's the dangers that we run into out in the field dealing with this. When this stuff gets spread on the road, it gets onto our trucks, it gets onto your vehicles. You track this home. It's not good no matter how you look at it. And it's a dangerous practice that has to be stopped.
Thank you, Chief. We're going to hand it off to our next speaker, former Athens County Commissioner Roxanne Groff.
Good evening, and well, I'm going to try to do a summation in what can we as citizens do about the information you all just heard by our experts who just presented. And I am a former county commissioner. I was a public official for 20 years now. I'm retired from all of that and just am kind of a part-time, full-time activist. And it's activism that moves citizens to make the information like you just heard tonight available and use it, and then educate other citizens, especially people who vote, and especially our elected officials. So what you see on the screen right now is Ohio agencies that the Ohio Brine Task Force, of which most of us on the screen, Mihir's from San Francisco, so he's with us in with his expert information that he has and is supporting what we do in our task force. But it was the Ohio Brine Task Force that spent 3 years working with the Ohio agencies that all deal with the use of oil and gas waste. And we call it toxic radioactive waste because that's exactly what it is. And the task force first started working with the Department of Transportation to try to help them understand and then convince them the possible long-term harms from the use of toxic radioactive waste in a product that is made out of oil and gas waste. And ODOT was, the Department of Transportation was using this product, and they had used it as a de-icer. And for almost 3 years, the task force worked with ODOT officials and finally convinced them, as the information that they got, that they researched and they understood about the potential harms of the use of toxic radioactive waste, oil and gas waste on their roads. Slowly but surely, they started to discontinue the use of the product until they no longer use the product, they no longer purchase it, and they no longer use it on state roads in the state of Ohio. And as you can see, their quote to us, and we have used it in the media, in media press releases, there are a lot more approved products on the market, so we have more options to choose from. They came to that conclusion because of the work that the Ohio Brine Task Force did to get them to finally stop using it. The Ohio Turnpike Commission also stopped using it. And they actually made the statement, due to the issues and complaints that ODOT and the communities are having regarding to potential health risks of the product aqua salina, which is the manufactured product out of oil and gas waste, we decided not to use it this year. And I believe that they have continued to not use it. We also worked with the Ohio Department of Health and ODNR. ODNR put out a statement after 3 years of working with them to join us in our efforts to get rid of the use of oil and gas waste brine as a de-icer or a dust suppressant. That finally the director of the Department of Natural Resources, Mary Mertz, says, and was quoted in the press, that it does not ensure the protection of the public health and of our environment. And that's a pretty strong statement from the Department of Natural Resources. And finally, the Ohio Department of Health agreed that because of the lack of studies on using this product, that they made the statement that it might be a possible health risk to people. So in addition to the Ohio Brine Task Force working with these very important agencies and get statements from them, we helped educate them and encourage them to make these statements. And as a result of our work, the state of Ohio no longer uses oil and gas waste as a de-icer. Now, it's a different story in the counties, and this is one of our most important tasks in front of us, and that is trying to educate local elected county and township officials to get them to agree and support our efforts from the task force to support a bill that would be introduced in the Ohio legislature that would actually prohibit the use of toxic radioactive oil and gas waste as a de-icer or as a dust suppressant. And why this is important is the legislature gives the authority to the county commissioners to approve the use of oil and gas waste brine on roads, either for a de-icer or as a suppressant. So 3 years ago, the Athens County Commissioners, I was not a commissioner then, but I was part of a group of citizens who were well educated in the harms that brine can cause when humans are exposed to it. And you just heard those very, very well put out by Mihir. That was excellent. And we'll probably be using your information in the future. But the Athens County Commissioners were one of the first counties to pass a resolution. It's just a simple resolution, just 2 pages. And it's the name of the resolution is a resolution opposing oil and gas brine spreading on public roads. That went to our legislature to be on the record as the Athens County Commissioners not only prohibit it on our roads in Athens County, but they also were asking the state legislature to pass legislation to prohibit it statewide. The Franklin County Commissioners also passed a resolution, and that was initiated by a citizen who went to the county engineer in Franklin County, and one of the engineers in the engineer department did some extensive research on the use of the product and decided that there were potential harmful effects, and went to the Franklin County Commissioners, and they also passed a resolution not allowing any use of oil and gas waste brine on their road. And the Trumbull Township trustees of Ashtabula County did a similar resolution. They held a public hearing, they presented information to the public, and they also passed a resolution to prohibit the use of oil and gas waste brine on their roads. Those are the only 3 that I know of right now. There could be others. We've done a webinar prior to this one that was presented to township trustees and county commissioners. It's in the archives of the County Commissioners Association, so any county commissioner can get a hold of that. And I think, what struck me with Mihir's comments was, since the EPA's doesn't have guidance on the exposure to and effects of the multiple chemical mixture. That is one of the reasons, because there are no guidelines and no state is doing any studies on health effects. That is one of the things that prompts our elected officials to kind of sit up and take a closer look at the use of oil and gas waste brine. It's like nobody's done any studies. And yet, if you put on the one side all the harmful effects, on the other side, the possibilities, but nobody's put a guidance together, that should be a red flag to any elected official to say, well, if it's not good, it's not good. And that sometimes prompts an elected official to sit up and take notice. And we want more of these resolutions done, because we are in hope that one of our lawmakers in the State House will be introducing a bill that will prohibit the use of oil and gas waste brine on our roads. It was introduced once, it came in at the end of a legislative session, and we're hoping this fall that this bill gets reintroduced. And the more people that are educated, the more people who are going to participate in letting their lawmakers know that this is something that is absolutely necessary for Ohio to do for the safety of its citizens.
So we are going to open it up to any audience questions. Let's give our presenters a round of applause, though, really quick.
I hear it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I'm going to go ahead and check the chat out. But before we get to questions, I wanted to again just thank our presenters, and an email will be sent out to all of our registration and our attendees with links to the quotes from different agencies talking about oil and gas waste that were listed in the slideshow. The resolutions will be in this document, a copy of this PowerPoint, and also a link to our to the YouTube of the recording of this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Go
I'm
ahead.
going to ask. Okay. First of all, thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. It was succinct. It was well organized. It hit all the high points, as well as some of the details that I think often get missed. So thank you all for this great presentation. I would like to address my question to Mihir Vohra. Is it Dr. Vohra?
Yeah, Vohra.
Vohra. Thank you. So I'm concerned about agricultural workers in these rural areas where dust suppressant brine is spread. Would you say that there's a higher risk for those people that have exposures from agricultural chemicals, along with, in other words, it's a multi-exposure issue that's not being researched, of course, a higher risk for those individuals, as well as animals that are exposed to this stuff in terms of their reproductive capabilities?
Yeah. I mean, for humans, you're exactly right that, when people are exposed to not just different chemicals, but like different sources of chemicals. So not just brine, but, agricultural sources, maybe things like pesticides. There's certainly a lot of potential for them to be at kind of additive risk. And we know very little about the health effects of exposures to any mixtures of chemicals. But I think you're definitely right to be concerned.
And what about the animals that are being raised on these farms and are breathing this dust that's being wafted over their grazing areas, along with whatever chemicals are sprayed or fertilizers and pesticides? So
yeah, we don't know too much about the health effects in animals of exposure to these things, beyond what's been done in like controlled laboratory settings. I think especially with animals raised for agricultural purposes, and especially ones that are mammals, we can hazard a good guess that they will also have adverse health effects, because the way their bodies function are very close to how ours do. Another concern too, if these are livestock animals, is that some chemicals in brine can bioaccumulate in animals. So this is maybe a phenomenon people are familiar with the chemical mercury, that like if animals get exposed to it, it gets deposited in their bodies and kind of stays there permanently. And then if we consume meat from those animals, we then get re-exposed and take on the kind of health effects because those chemicals are kind of residing in the tissue and meat of those animals. So that can be of concern to humans as well.
So this stuff could work its way up through the food chain to humans, even if humans aren't exposed to it initially.
Definitely, yeah. So there are some chemicals that are known to be in brine that do bioaccumulate. And so you're right, people could get exposed to these brine chemicals even if they're not being directly exposed to the brine itself.
Okay, yuck. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Other questions? Julie Betker mentioned fish from Lake Erie have mercury. So that's an example of bioaccumulation in the Great Lakes. There's somebody personally messaged me in the chat a question with different wells where brine comes from. There are different chemicals. Are some wells worse than others? I mean, Roxanne, I think you know about that, right? There's some wells that are more radioactive than others.
Yes, that's true. And Julie knows that also. The brine that's used on roads that Ohio allows to be used as an ice de-icer or a dust suppressant comes from conventional wells. So they're not coming from the wells that are fracked. Most people, I think, know the difference between a horizontally drilled well and a conventionally drilled well. And the thought was, I'm sure, when the legislature revised the statutes, they didn't think about the fact that conventional wells had radium in them, and they didn't ask and nobody told them. So in the testing that ODNR, the Department of Natural Resources, conducted on conventional wells, there were very varying amounts of radioactive material, radium-226 and radium-228, and some of it being as much as what you would find in a horizontally drilled well. So, you know, we increased the pressure of our you know, increased our determination in trying to get the state legislature to introduce a bill to get this off the roads at all, because not every well is tested. As a matter of fact, no wells are tested for radium. ODNR did this because of the efforts that the Ohio Brine Task Force put to them, and our pressure that we put on them, saying that, you know, this stuff is full of radioactivity and you know it. And they did know it. They've known it since 1985. So yeah, the answer to that is yes, there's varying amounts, and because nobody tests the wells individually, all of it needs to go. I think Julie has a follow-up to that.
Yeah, Dr. Julie, let's hear your follow-up to that.
Yeah. Well, and it's even more insidious than that, because the assumption is that you only get all of those other chemicals in the horizontally fracked wells. What people don't recognize is that we've been fracking vertical wells for at least 30 years in this state. So all the stuff they're dumping into the horizontal wells, they're also dumping into the vertical wells as they frack them to get better production. So there's nothing magical about whether they're horizontal versus vertical as to what else is in that brine. And I think that's a critical component. Going back to the research that Roxanne was talking about, we had levels as high as 9,500 picocuries per liter out of a vertical well that is on Kent State's property in Portage County. We have horizontal wells with lower levels than that. So it's really a function of which formations they're removing the oil and gas from, and what is the geochemistry of that particular location, because it can be significantly different, you know, 10 miles away or 50 miles away. So it's not a one size fit all. We must assume that you're dealing with a pretty good dose. And only through testing can you demonstrate that maybe you're not. Of everything that they tested, we only had one well that met the state and federal requirements of not dumping more than 60 picocuries per liter of radium-226 and 60 picocuries per liter of 228. Everything else that they ran, and it was 150 other ones, were above that, to significantly above that. And when you look at the half-life of radium-226, it's 1,600 years. So if you started out with 9,000 picocuries per liter in that tank, you'd have to hold on to it for 1,600 years to get it to come down to 4,500. And if the threshold is 60, think about how many more you'd have to hold on to it. So basically, the one from Kent State, you'd have to put in a tank and hold aside for as long into the future as we've been from having continental glaciation of ice sheets over Ohio. So this is not something that is a quick fix. It's not something that disappears quickly. These are long-term, forever chemicals and elements, and we need to appreciate that once they're spread on our surface, they're going to hang around. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Julie. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have another question for Roxanne. I think you're the right person to answer this. It's my understanding that the state of Pennsylvania has banned the use of brine spreading on its roads. Is that correct?
Kind of. And
Yeah.
I say kind of because they did stop the use of it. They didn't ban it. They stopped it because they realized that they didn't have any legislative authority to allow it. So there have been bills in the Pennsylvania legislature wanting to use it and wanting to ban it. So there's two. They actually have more legislators in the Pennsylvania legislature that are interested in banning it than we do in Ohio, sadly. But they did stop the use of it because they weren't allowed. They didn't have the authority, which is an interesting scenario because they're not using it there, which is great, which has given people who have been interested in pushing legislation to ban it altogether, to mobilize and educate other legislators and citizens that this is a really important issue for them. So they've got two sets of laws going on at the same time. One group wanting to pass it and one to use it, and one group wanting it passed to stop the use of it. So they didn't really ban it, but it is not, as far as I know, the last time I read up on an article from Pennsylvania on this, they were not using it.
So the difference,
it's a good fluke to find.
So the difference then between Ohio and Pennsylvania, it's the same brine and the same risk, but the difference is that in Ohio there are laws that have allow it to be spread
Since 1985.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and in Pennsylvania, there are laws. There are no laws that allow it to be spread.
I think, yeah, and you can't quote me on this because I haven't read up on what the process is of the moment, Ginny, but it's the last time I read articles on it, they stopped it because they couldn't find the authority that was ever passed by the legislature to allow it. And
okay, so in Ohio, it was the 1985 legislation that created this mess.
Yep, you'd think if since 1985 someone would have come up with a way to to get rid of it, but that's what the Ohio Brine Task Force is working on, and we've made a lot of progress. Anton has been an excellent campaigner on our behalf. We write to our legislators on a regular basis. I mean, there was a moment in time where they were getting memes and messages from us on sometimes a daily basis on a from month to month and holiday to holiday, and all of it was very, very cleverly done and targeted specifically to get these lawmakers to pay attention to this toxic, radioactive, potentially health risking activity that we're doing in Ohio. And I think Pennsylvania has some legislators that have been educated very well on the subject and are very anxious to do the same thing Ohio is in getting rid of this stuff.
Thank you.
So we were all babies in 1985. Anyway, some of us weren't even born, right? So what did we know? Yeah. So this is a question for Mihir, and I don't mean to hog the floor please jump in or
Yeah,
smack me down. If you need
let's
to.
just make sure that there's no other questions before
Yeah.
we go with your next question, Jenny. Sorry.
Okay.
Anybody else have anything? The floor is yours, Jenny.
Thank you. So what kind of recommendations would you make? This is for Dr. Vohra, relative to science for the state of Ohio, whether it's Ohio State or Kent State or wherever. What kind of recommendations would you make relative to the science that we need to prove your point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think what we need is a different orientation to protecting health than the government currently has. You know, right now, the government and, you know, EPA are kind of operating in this like reactive space where they're trying to say, okay, what is the actual risk? What amounts of chemicals are safe for people to be exposed to? How can we maybe help people after they've been exposed to a chemical and have some health effects? And I think what we really need is an orientation to these chemicals that the government protects us from them before we get exposed. You know, some chemicals like uranium and lead and like PFAS, which we didn't talk about today, scientifically, we basically know there is almost no level of exposure to them that is safe. And so what we really need is the government to be more proactive and say that we need to stop companies from being allowed to do things that expose people to these chemicals, rather than saying, okay, once you've been exposed to these chemicals, how can we help you on the margins? Because again, like I mentioned with zinc, like some of those health effects can happen and can be long lasting, even if you've only been exposed for a brief period of time. So I think we really need to reorient, you know, our communities and our government to protecting us before we get exposed.
Would you say, in other words, prove the safety of the chemical before we have to prove its relationship to disease?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if we're, you know, going to, you know, to be guided by science in that, we also need to be, you know, willing to, you know, to update regulations based on scientific evidence that, you know, we may get better evidence or better methodology or better technology that allows us to, you know, update our scientific understanding of dangers, and then regulations should also be updated based on that.
Chief, did you want to hop in there really quick?
What?
Sorry,
Sorry,
Chief has his hand up. I wanted him to hop in there.
Oh, sorry. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, with the compare and contrast on Ohio and Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania has something going for it that Ohio doesn't. With the last governor that got in, he instituted a environmental crimes unit that's run by a couple of people that I've worked with, and they actively go after people that have done crimes and haven't damaged the environment, irregardless of what any laws would say. The problem we have here in Ohio is the people that are being put in play to be the heads of the watchdogs aren't much of a watchdog. In fact, they don't even know what dog they're talking with. So there's two different approaches here. And the other thing that you got to deal with is that for the past 4 years, prior to this current administration in DC, the state federal EPA didn't have much of a watchdog group with them. I mean, they quite literally had the fox guarding the hen house at the federal EPA level. So all these chemicals that they're supposed to look at and determine whether or not they are dangerous just never got done. There's a backlog of God knows how much going on over there that I keep hearing about. So this is the world in which we enter into, and you can see how one bad administration, either state, federal, or local, can set back all of this for years. Years.
Thank you for that answer, Chief. We have time for maybe just one more quick question, and then we're going to let our presenters go. Is there anybody else who has a question? Okie doke. Hearing none, I'm just going to remind everyone that you're going to get an email as an attendee, as a registrant of this webinar. You're going to get the link, YouTube link, to rewatch this webinar so you can share it with your friends and family. You're going to get a PowerPoint slideshow, and you're going to get all of the resources that we talked about, covering the resolutions and the agency stances on brine. So yeah, let's just give our presenters one more round of applause. Thank you so much for, I mean, this was a wonderful webinar. So thank you again. And if you'd like to join us at the Buckeye Environmental Network or Ohio Brine Task Force, I'm going to go ahead and just pop up our emails really quick, just so that you guys can get in touch with any questions that you may have with any of the presenters, actually.
And Anton, can we stay on for a minute?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, thank you, everyone. The meeting is now concluded. Please have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much.